Hi, everybody. Today we are going to be talking about trends in Mac threats. But before we get started, just a little bit about myself. My name is Thomas Reed, and I am the Director of Mac and Mobile at Malwarebytes. And part of my job there involves doing a lot of threat research on the Mac side. So I've seen a lot of interesting things, and we're going to be talking about some of the data and some of the malware and behaviors that I have seen over the last year or so. So first, if we could talk a little bit about data. We did a study last year where we looked at all of the data that we'd gotten across all of 2019, and we published the results on our website. Some of you may have actually seen that. For those of you who didn't, we're going to just summarize a little bit. What we saw was that Mac detections are gaining on Windows. Now, this pie chart here doesn't really look all that impressive, Mac only at 14% of our detections. But you have to keep in mind that we have many, many millions of Windows machines and not nearly as many Macs with Malwarebytes software installed on them. So in order to really look at the data a little more accurately, we looked at the number of detections per machine on average. And what we saw is that Macs were getting infected in 2019 almost 2 times more than Windows, at least among machines that have Malwarebytes installed. We also saw that Mac detections overall for 2019 were about 4 times higher than for 2018. So we're definitely seeing a big rise in Mac threats. Which is not unexpected. You know, Mac market share is becoming greater, and so it's obviously a bigger target for attackers. So if we look at exactly what we're detecting, the top 10 threats on the Mac make up about 84% of the total. And all 10 of those are PUPs, which is an abbreviation for potentially unwanted programs, and adware. So none of this is really the truly malicious stuff, the stuff that's trying to steal your data or, do keylogging or any of that kind of stuff. So if you look at actual malware, the most common one is only detected at about 0.3% of all of our detections. So it's not a huge slice of the pie, but malware is actually some of the worst stuff you can get on your computer. So that's some of the, even though it's not a large slice of the pie, it's still something you need to be aware of and you need to be wary of. So let's take a look at some of the notable malware threats that we've seen so far in 2020. And the first one of those that we're going to talk about is one called ThiefQuest, also originally called EvilQuest, until it was learned that there was a video game by the same name. So we call it ThiefQuest now. And this malware was downloaded via torrents through some modified copies of legitimate apps. So in the case of this screenshot here, it was a Little Snitch installer that was downloaded through a torrent from a Russian torrenting forum. And if you downloaded that and installed it, you would actually get Little Snitch, but you'd also get infected with malware. So at first glance, we believed that this was ransomware, and there were some good reasons for that. It started encrypting files when you installed it, and it also dropped a ransom note, which you can see here on the right in this screenshot. So obviously ransomware, right? Well, as we dug in a little deeper, we saw some things that were not really consistent with ransomware. So for example, everyone who got the ransomware every machine got exactly the same ransom note with exactly the same Bitcoin address. And that's not normal for ransomware. That means that if somebody sends a payment to that address, there's no way for the criminals on the end to know who sent that payment. So that's kind of suspicious. And then on top of that, there's no email address in this note. So there's no way to contact the malware author and tell them that you've paid, request your decryption keys or whatever. So this was kind of looking like it was a little bit suspicious. And then we found it was actually exfiltrating a very large amount of data from the system. So it looks like at this point, the ransom activity is actually fake. It's just a distraction. It's there to throw up a whole bunch of, bells and whistles and keep you looking at that rather than learning that this malware is collecting data from your system. So what it was actually doing, and I caught this when I was looking at the network activity that was going out, is that it's exfiltrating files from the user folder via HTTP, and it's just going through sequentially, picking files with certain extensions and sending them up to the server. It also does a lot of other interesting things like keylogging. It does some viral infection of other binaries in the user folder. For example, some Google Chrome update files. Those are Mac OS binary files, executable files, and the malware was adding malicious code to the beginning of those. Now, the interesting thing here is that the encryption key was actually written in plain text to the end of the encrypted files. So at this point, if somebody did actually get infected and had their file encrypted and had no backups, there is a way to decrypt those files. So another piece of malware we saw is one called Bird Miner. And this one, as it sounds, is a crypto miner. So that means that it's designed to mine cryptocurrency, in this case, one called Monero. And this malware was distributed through piracy of a large number of audio apps. A lot of these were available through the VST crack site. There were some others as well, but this was really the main one. And VST crack had large numbers of audio apps that were all pirated. They'd all been cracked somehow and had been used to distribute this malware. And the way that this malware worked is that it actually installed a virtual machine program called QEMU, thus the name Bird Miner. And this emulator would actually run a Linux tiny shell system with the open source XMRig Monero miner installed. And so it was really difficult to tell exactly what this malware was doing. We've also seen a lot of malware from the North Korean hacking group known as Lazarus. Some of those pieces of malware are called Fall Chill, Gamera or Jamera, or however you say that, and Dackel's Rat. There's also another one called Yort, which is it's sometimes called by one of these other names as well. So we'll just stick to these three for now. But Lazarus actually comes, these Lazarus malware samples actually come typically in the form of either legitimate Trojanized apps or fake apps that are Trojanized somehow. And a lot of them come in the form of stock trading apps or cryptocurrency apps. Some of them are open source apps that have been modified. Others are just fabricated completely. You can see an example of one of those here on the right. There was one case of an album app. That's what the screenshot on this previous slide was. I kind of like that screenshot because it looks a little creepy, like, you know, some Japanese horror movie. And there was a one-time password app, kind of like Google Authenticator or Authy. But it was actually, and it actually worked, but it also installed malware. And some of the early versions also used malicious Word documents that would have a malicious macro that managed to escape the sandbox and install files on the system, which macros in Microsoft Office are not supposed to be able to do. So there's also, you know, this was created before some additional malware samples came out. So there have been some other subsequent ones. We won't talk about those here in the interest of time. But there have been some other pieces of malware that have appeared. Instead, we're going to go on and we're going to talk about some nasty tricks that we've seen adware doing. Now, this is really interesting because malware on macOS a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times is kind of lame. It's not very sophisticated, and it's pretty simple. But adware is actually become very, very complex on macOS, and it's some of the most sophisticated stuff that you'll see. So let's take a look at what some of the techniques adware creators are using to get installed and do some of the nasty things that they do. So first of all, for getting installed, we've seen some malware that was modifying a copy of Safari. So basically, this malware would obscure the whole screen. You can see here on the right, this is what your screen would look like. It's actually hidden everything, all your desktop icons, you know, any windows that are open, everything's obscured. And while this happens, while it has done this, in the background, it has made a copy of Safari, modified some JavaScript files found inside the app bundle, and then launched that modified copy of Safari, all of which is not seen because the screen is obscured. And then after that modified copy of Safari launches, it quits that app and deletes it. And at this point, if you open the legitimate version of Safari again, you'll find that some settings have been changed. And most notably, a browser extension in Safari has been activated without you having to click any buttons. Normally, if you want to install a browser extension in Safari, something will come up that you have to explicitly click an allow button in. So you may have questions about this. You know, well, if they modified a copy of Safari, why did macOS let it run? Wouldn't that break the code signature? Yes, technically it breaks the code signature. But because that copy of Safari was not quarantined, so in other words, it hadn't been downloaded from the internet, macOS is perfectly happy to open it up without checking the code signature. So that's a bit of a problem. Another thing that we've seen adware doing is installing malicious profiles. These are system configuration profiles, the sort of thing that you might push down from an MDM like Jamf. But in this case, they're being installed with the profiles command line utility. And these profiles, one of which you can see here in this screenshot in system preferences, have a couple goals. Their goals are to lock down the Safari and or Chrome home pages and the search settings. And so once these profiles are installed, you'll find that in Safari and Chrome, you can no longer change your home page or your search engine. And that's because these are now considered to be managed, even though this was not deployed via an MDM. And there's really no API provided by Apple for managing this. So antivirus software really can't safely remove these things. So if you see this sort of thing, You will notice there are a large number of malicious URLs. I've given an example here, searchmine.net, but there are many, many others. If you see this, those profiles need to be removed from the system you see it on. Another technique is something called managed preferences. And in this case, what we see is that Chrome becomes managed, very similar to what happens with the system configuration profiles, but not quite exactly the same cause. We've also seen Safari managed in this manner, but a lot less frequently. Most of the time it's Chrome. And again, these managed settings can't be changed by the user within Safari or Chrome. And the files that are responsible for setting these preferences are found in the library/managed preferences folder. So if you see things in there and you as an admin didn't put them there, they need to be deleted. We also see adware that is making a lot of sudoers changes, sudoers file changes. So as you probably know, the sudoers file is a file on the system that determines who is able to get root permissions. So a non-admin user should never be in the sudoers file. Admin users typically are found in the sudoers file, but they shouldn't have certain kinds of access. Now, what adware has been doing is it'll make one of two changes to the sudoers file to allow continued sudoers access without a password. So if you look here at these two examples, the first one sets a no password requirement for a particular process. So that process can use sudo all at once without a password running under this user. But no other process can do that. So that's not good, but it's relatively safe. Not that you want this, but it's harder to abuse that. On the other hand, a lot of malware is also doing the second one, which basically lets all processes running under the user execute sudo with no password requirement whatsoever. And so that means that if I were a malware author and I infected this system and adware had been present and done this, that means I have zero work to do. I can get root permissions and do whatever I want to, all without a password. So these changes create a vulnerability that can be taken advantage of in the future by malware, potentially. So if you see these changes in a sudoers file on one of your endpoints, you definitely want to fix that. Another thing that we've seen is that adware will do man-in-the-middle attacks. Now, obviously, this sounds like more of a malware behavior. And obviously, malware does do this because it uses this technique to grab your network data. It's a very handy way for malware to just hoover up a whole bunch of data on all of your web browsing, all of your network traffic, and really get a lot of very sensitive data. But adware, on the other hand, is also using this not to suck up all that data, but to inject data into the stream, to inject ads into your HTTP and HTTPS traffic. And one of the most common programs used is an open source program called MITM proxy. And this is something that's designed to allow web development admins to debug some of their code and see exactly what's going on. But adware is using it to inject ads. And they're also using, as you can see from this screenshot here on the right, they're installing a trusted profile for MITM proxy to allow them to inject data into the HTTPS traffic, not just the unencrypted HTTP traffic. And as antivirus, as the creator of some antivirus, we've seen that if we detect and remove that MITM proxy software when it's installed maliciously, which really needs to be done to protect the user, it unfortunately causes a loss of network connectivity. And so in those cases, you've still got to go into the network proxy settings and remove all the settings for those proxies that were set up. You also definitely want to go and look for any of these, unwanted certificates in the keychain that will give the attacker the ability to snoop on your encrypted web traffic. We also see a lot of data collection in adware. Now, it's a different kind of data collection than malware. Malware is after your documents, your passwords, your certificates that may be used to give you access to a system through SSH or something like that. What we see with adware is that it's a very different kind of data that's being gobbled up, but it's still not data you probably want to be out there. So some of the less invasive information is things like a unique identifier for the computer. That's something that just about every piece of software out there that uses license keys or anything like that is going to collect. Your IP address, again, that's something you send to every single website you go to. And then it gets a little more, intrusive, your username, things like macOS version, Safari version, etc., versions of all the different software that the adware is interested in. And then it gets worse. It gets, things like a list of everything you've got installed on the system. Applications in the applications folder, installed launch agents and daemons, installed system configuration profiles. Interestingly, we've seen some that collect the version of the malware removal tool. This is actually a program that's part of macOS. It's a little bit of a black box. We know what it does, but not exactly how it does it. It's essentially what it says. It's a malware removal tool that at certain times, we don't know exactly when, it will look for and remove malware from your system. We don't know exactly what malware it removes. We can get some ideas by reverse engineering it, looking at some of the strings inside. But we really don't know for sure how it works or what it's looking for. And when it does find and remove something, you'll never know because no notification is ever shown to the user. But there's really only one reason that adware would want to find out the version of that tool, and that is because in some cases, this tool actually detects some adware. So they would clearly want to know what version is installed so that they know whether to install this payload or that payload. And these are just some examples of the data. There's a lot more, and there's also a lot more potential for data exfiltration. With some of this adware doing proxying, there's definitely the possibility for either intentional or accidental data exfiltration of your network data. Even though adware is something that a lot of people think is just a nuisance, it's still something that you really don't want on your computer because it can lead to vulnerabilities being opened up. It can lead to either accidental or intentional data collection, and all number of other issues. So if we sum up everything that we've talked about here, first of all, we know that Mac malware is on the rise. And like I said earlier, we believe that this is in part due to the rising market share of the Mac. It's also likely to be caused by who uses Macs. If you look at Windows machines, there are a lot of really dirt cheap Windows machines out there. Are the people buying those really good targets? Maybe, maybe not. On the other hand, if somebody is out there buying a $2,000, $3,000 Mac, are they a good target? Pretty definitely yes. So between increasing market share and simply the cost of the hardware, meaning you're a better target, we fully expect for Mac malware to continue to increase over the next few years and into the future. We have seen that Apple has been doing a lot of things to combat malware with each version of the system, and those are only meeting with some success. For example, in response to macOS Catalina, which puts more requirements on notarization and code signing, we're seeing a lot of malware coming these days uncode signed. So rather than signing, they're just walking the user through the process of how to open an unsigned app, which still, even in Catalina, is not all that hard. We also know that although malware is rare, it can really be nasty. If you look at what some of these things do, like ThiefQuest, it really can grab a lot of your data and do a lot of damage to your system. Further, a lot of times malware it's sneaky and it can stay hidden for years. If we look back in time, back a few years, there was a piece of malware that was called Fruit Fly. It was discovered in 2017. And that malware was doing things like, accessing the webcam, the microphone, and that sort of thing. And it was actually being used to create things like child pornography. And it had been in the wild undetected for 10 years. So that's pretty nasty. That's pretty disturbing. And it's, this stuff is definitely not something you want on your endpoints. And finally, we talked about how adware can actually be just as sneaky and malicious, if not more so, than Mac malware. Adware is doing all kinds of things, accessing data, using vulnerabilities to get itself installed, causing vulnerabilities after it gets installed. So even though adware is generally thought of as less dangerous, you really, really don't want that on your systems. And I just want to thank everybody for listening. And as the slide says, please provide some feedback using the survey. Thank you.